Welcome to the Fall Academic Speaker Series. This is the fourth of our series this fall and the final one. I was really delighted when Jeff Burgess, who arranges all of these presentations, asked me to introduce tonight's speaker. I've known Dave for, we decided today, close to 20 years. And I've never had a boring conversation with him. I expect tonight will be an interesting, sometimes provocative, wide-ranging presentation, and I hope conversation. I know Dave would appreciate it if you don't hold back in real questions that you have to ask, because that gets at what's real for you, what's real for him. And I think in large part, that's what Dave is doing in his art. He's digging for what's real. When my son was 16, didn't really know what he wanted to do, Dave invited him to be his studio assistant down in Providence. Well, we live in Vermont. This was Providence, Rhode Island. My son was 16. I knew that this was risky. I also figured that it was more risky not to let him go and do it. Because I knew that something would happen, that he would change in some way, which he did. I figured he probably wouldn't just be learning how to mix paint, which he might not even have learned. But he did learn how to procure materials in some unorthodox ways. He did learn how to stay up late and still get up early so he could be at the studio ready to work whenever Dave came in. He did learn something about urban spelunking, I believe. And he learned what was really interesting to him, because he spent a summer being with Dave, being really interested in what Dave was interested in. One of the things I know about Dave is that he has a very flexible, versatile, quick mind, and that he loves materials. He loves the thingness of things. And he loves to see what happens when you put one element together with another element, like pink paint and high-powered weapons. What could happen? Some interesting stuff. Or knitting needles and $1 bills. What could you do with that? Some interesting stuff. Dave's work is provocative. I don't think for the sake of being provocative, though. I think for the sake of getting at what's real. So I'd like you to help me welcome Dave Cole tonight.
Thank you. And thanks to Jeff for setting all this up, and to Landmark for inviting me to come down. It's a great privilege to be back. It was here that I really got set up to take off and do what I ended up doing. So, as far as the structure tonight, I figure that I'll run a quick introduction through my work for folks who don't know my work at all, and then sort of meander through some of my thoughts about art generally, and some things that I think about when I'm making art, about how and why and what it means. And then hoping to open it up for questions and start a bit of a discussion. So, I started knitting in 1998. You have to understand that when I was in school, it was the time period of a show called Sensation, the Brooklyn Museum. It was there was a lot of furor over elephant dung being put on the Virgin Mary, and it was when Damien Hirst and that whole generation of young British artists were sort of coming of age. Very sort of shock art. Something that I sort of regarded as being, I don't know, somewhat adolescent. Artwork that was shocking for the sake of being shocking. And almost as if it was attempting to captivate almost as if it was attempting to captivate its audience by offending or alienating them, rather than something like knitting, which engaged its audience by making it giggle, or by being captivating or interested, or fundamentally accessible. I also learned, I also was, having been a student at Landmark, interested in the idea of accessibility. Accessibility of education, accessibility of environments, accessibility of something as simple as buildings. So the idea to knit artwork sort of came to me. This was the first piece that I knit, first piece of art that I knit. It's called Electric Blanket. It's as simple as taking extension cords that I bought at Home Depot and knitting them on 4-foot-long knitting needles. It's a close-up. One of the things that I love about knitting and about textile work generally is the way that the final object is very directly composed of the process that made it. I don't know how to be more clear than that, but that you're at all times aware of every single action that went into making this object. And it asks all kinds of questions about work and labor and absurdity and all kinds of things like that. This is a teddy bear knit out of lead. I was able to procure from a lead manufacturer this lead ribbon that I was then able to process, and then it's actually stuffed with lead wool, which they use for pounding into the cracks in like reactor rooms and nuclear submarines and things like X-ray rooms and things like that. And yeah, it's very heavy and very dense, and I like the juxtaposition of ideas that's happening in this piece. So this piece sort of came after that piece. It's fiberglass insulation. And that, I have a pointer. Oh, cool. I've never had a pointer before. So that's the registrar of the museum standing next to the piece. And this is a piece that I think has a great deal of relevance to my experience at Landmark, my experiences growing up in the special ed room, my experiences that brought me to here to bring me to there. One of the things about my work is people want to touch it. And I like that. People who would never in a million years dream of touching a piece of artwork in a museum or a gallery will go right up to it like this. So that piece there, which is another lead teddy bear, which is slightly larger, that's the day that I arrived. And I had a conversation with a bunch of the curators that were standing around, and I said, one thing you should know is that people touch my work. That people who would never dream of touching work in a museum will walk around and touch it. And they got very huffy with me. Well, you people who patronize our museum understand a certain standard of behavior. I said, fine, it's not going to hurt the artwork. I don't care. Things made out of metal, whatever. 2 days later, I go back, and there's this really pretty plexiglass box over the top of the piece of art. And I just sort of casually inquired, so that's a very nice plexiglass box you built. And they sort of said, well, we had to station a guard next to the piece because everybody who walked past it wanted to touch it. This is probably the piece that I'm best known for. It was an installation that I did at MassMoCA, Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art. That summer, all of the cultural institutions in the Berkshires were sharing a theme, so you could go from museum to museum or concert to concert, and it sort of had some continuity through the region. And it was folk art, Americana, was sort of the theme, so MassMoCA invited me up to do Americana MassMoCA style. So we actually did knit all of the stitches to make the flag. There's a video on YouTube, but I was standing on a cherry picker up there. I like this laser pointer. And directing the operators, one of whom was Clark Sopper, Karen's son, who's probably in the excavator. We couldn't get him out of it. To knit all of these stitches. So I'm very driven by materials also. I love, well, like Karen said it, I love the thingness of materials. let me back up for a second. Anytime an artist talks about what his or her work means, you should treat it with a modicum of skepticism. Because as far as I'm concerned, at least speaking for myself, the artist is an unreliable narrator when discussing his own work. Because truthfully, I don't know what the hell's going on in my work. What I do is I spend a lot of time talking to a lot of people and having these very intense conversations about all kinds of random things, and doing reading and taking in as much information as I can, learning as much about materials as I can, and then almost all of the time the idea pops fully formed into my mind, and I make it. So looking back at it, I can say, well, this was going on in my life, and I was reading about this, and I was thinking about this, and I just had a conversation about that. But really, I don't know what was going on. So take everything that I say with a grain of salt, which you should anyway. This is baby clothing. It's part of a series made out of Kevlar body armor from the first Gulf War. The Army's in the process of decommissioning that series, that model of body armor, and replacing it with a newer generation. So they're decommissioning a lot of flak jackets. So I was able to get a hold of a few of them. And we made a whole series of baby clothing out of only the materials that were on the flak vests. Even to the point of the little grommets on the shoes were ventilation grommets in the back of the vests, and the snaps. Everything was a part of the vest. And this conjures to mind, what kind of a world would one live in when this was the most available surplus material with which to serve this need, and all kinds of other things. And it seemed like a good idea at the time. This piece is made entirely of toy soldiers. That's actually a close-up of that piece. This piece is at a museum now down in Knoxville? Somewhere down south. But the entire piece had to be rotated and painted with, buckets of paint. And when my work is most successful, it operates on a number of levels at once. I feel like that. I find that the work that I like best, let me put this a different way. I don't want to tell anybody what to think. I don't even really know what I think most of the time. So I certainly don't want to tell you what to think. There is no punchline. There is no conclusion sentence. There is no easy takeaway line. If you find it, you haven't dug deep enough, because there's another meaning underneath that one that will most likely contradict what you thought it said. That I feel that my work is most successful when it is able to be apprehended for what it is, just for what it is, for the form of the thing. It has an immediate meaning that is entirely valid, whether it's boys playing with trucks and the acrobatics of knitting with giant machines, or whether it's this monumental American flag that's the size of a casket flag. And then you learn a little more, and it means a different thing that contradicts the first thing. And then you learn something else, and it might contradict that. Because I feel that anything worth saying, there's nothing simple to say it about. Like anything worth talking about, there's no simple statement to be made. I mean, if I wanted to make simple statements, I'd go into the bumper sticker business. The margins are better. That instead, I'd rather make provocative objects that get a conversation going. One of the side effects is that people are constantly projecting their own feelings onto my work. And I will show the same piece and have 5 people telling me how important the piece is as a criticism of US action. And I'll have just the same number of people tell me that that is such a nuanced view of patriotism. And yeah, it's true. Because the truth is not black or white, and it's definitely not gray. It's black and white at the same time. You know, anything worth saying about anything worth talking about is complicated. These are bullets and bullet fragments that were all fired and recovered. I sorted them by color and then sort of glued them down individually. This is what my studio assistants affectionately call squirrel art. And then they're all hand polished. But again, it's this contrast between these objects. It really doesn't come through in a photograph. It's like jewelry. It's so beautiful. Like the Providence is a hub of costume jewelry industry, still is actually. And so I have like a world-class polishing and jewelry supply, polishers and jewelers supply, which is like one of the foremost jewelry polishing equipment and supply retailers in the country, advising me on how to polish it. So they've got a nice deep luster, and they're luscious and they're beautiful, and then you realize that every single one of these objects is a relic of a potentially deadly experience. That every single one of those objects is capable of ending a life. And then they meld together and become an object. That's why I love textiles and love the sort of the edge of sculpture that rubs up against textiles, because it's constantly playing with that component versus whole. This is made out of lead. It's all hand sewn with stainless steel aircraft cable, sort of ultra fine cable. So the whole thing is actually made of metal, but it reads like fabric. And I'm interested in that sort of nuanced play. The only time one sees a flag wrinkled like that, it's moving. But this isn't moving, which means being in the same room with it is really visually disconcerting, because it's sort of, your eye is looking for the motion that isn't there, and it's sort of, it's sort of a trip. A couple of years ago, I got really obsessively interested in T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. It's a poem written, appropriately enough, today being the 11th of November, but a poem written, one could argue, from the perspective of Europe after the First World War. And these are all shell casings, individually hand cut, and then glued down into this, screwed down, and the ground between them is melted bullets. And again, it plays with that sort of luscious jewelry-like transcendence of, again, something that every one of which is a potentially deadly act of violence. So, craft. There is this, there are both an anti-craft and an anti-craftsmanship movement in contemporary art right now that I'm very much not a fan of. And in fact, I think some of the most dynamic work being done in any of the arts is being done and completely disregarded in the rubric of craft right now. But there also seems to be an anti-craftsmanship sentiment right now in contemporary art that drives me absolutely bugshit. And so there's a little bit of, nothing is more crafty than turning wood. So I decided to do that because I could. This piece is called 3 Generations. They are the models of hand grenades used during the Second World War in Korea, Vietnam, and then current theater of operations in an oil-rich country near you. they are, I mean, it's the baby boomers' parents, the baby boomers, and the baby boomers' kids. It's called Three Generations, and they actually do rattle. I modeled and then had cast in sterling silver the tops and then turned to wood, but it's, yeah. I'm fascinated by this tragic relationship between the evolution of technology and the evolution of violence. And, you know, violence is as much a part of the human condition as lungs or a heart, or at least it always has been. And it changes as we change, and you know, if somebody asked me today about if I have any cultural influences, you know, what cultural influences do I bring to my work? And it's really the culture of being an American in the 20th century. It is a time period of such unbelievable advancement and such catastrophic loss that it's impossible to get your mind around. You know, I mean, infant mortality dropped by 90%. Maternal mortality dropped by 99%. Hunger dropped by 500%. The worldwide. We went from heavier than air flight to walking on the moon in 66 years. 66 years we went from heavier than air flight to walking on the moon. We saw antibiotics. We saw urban planning. We saw all of these unbelievable advancements, and we saw, you know, Stalin in the Ukraine, and we saw Hitler in Poland, and we saw Pol Pot in Cambodia. Yeah, I got that right? Yeah,
Yes.
I got that right. Okay. I'm an American. We don't know these things. But I digress. This piece was made for a solo show that was like a year and a half ago. During my show happened to be the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Antietam, which is the deadliest day in American history. More Americans died on that day than any other day thus far. So I took lead type and leftover bullet fragments and melted them together and made this giant enlargement of a regulation. I think it was pattern of 1857 or 1859. I forget what year the pattern was really. Anyway, standard belt buckle of the U.S. Army during the Civil War. And it has this, I mean, first of all, it weighs, I don't know, 40 pounds probably. It's just massive, and it has this sort of like wrestler championship belt scale to it. And, all right. Oh, and now we're at the music box. So I got my hands on a cat, full-size cat vibratory roller compactor, because I know a guy, and turned it into a music box. And it plays the Star Spangled Banner. And you can find it on YouTube. And it sounds like kids banging on trash cans and clanging and banging, and it's brutal and disturbing and dirge-like. And you're giggling about it, and that's awesome. And that's what I was talking about earlier, that I don't think that contemporary art has to make people feel bad about themselves for not knowing enough about art. Just don't think it has to. I think, you know, I'm telling anybody what to do, and do whatever you want, but I'm very proud of the fact that my work doesn't do that. That my work is accessible. That people who might not feel a lot of access to contemporary art can take something away from it. Now, if you want to dig down, there's meat there. You know, if you want to bite into it, it'll bite back. But you don't have to. And I don't know, I find that find something very satisfying about that. So I'm trying to think about what else I was going to say that I haven't said yet. I'm sure I'll think about it. But you know what? I think I'm going to end there and open it up for questions. I think that's what I'm going to do. So then,
what continues to inspire you to keep making abstract art like this?
if this is abstract, I'd hate to see concrete. Conceptually driven, they keep paying me for it. I don't know. I mean,
That's a good thing.
Because it's what I do, and I have.
But like, is there a hidden like there has to be something that's driven you all these years to continue to do it, not just the money, not just.
Yeah, I wish I knew so I could get it removed. No, I don't know. I mean, when I started out trying to do it for a career, it was because I had to do it anyway, so I might as well try and get paid for it. And I've been unbelievably lucky and incredibly fortunate, and had 1,000 lucky breaks, and the support of amazing people, and have been able to put all of the amazing opportunities together to be able to support myself doing this, and it's fantastic. Yeah, I don't know what keeps me going, but I don't know.
Just cause.
Just cause.
Could you say more about the anti-craft bias, perhaps, that you perceive in the art world now? Just sort of what's that perspective? And I'm not familiar with that.
Never heard the perspective exactly articulated, but I can tell you that if I go around the Lower East Side or Chelsea, or even some museums, I see the most dilapidated collection of bullshit hipster garbage art that I can possibly imagine. That it's just embarrassing to me to call myself a professional artist if this is my peer group. You know, I mean, my gallery hates it when I say that, but it's true. I can't look at art magazines anymore. I don't go to galleries anymore. I'm not plugged into what's happening in contemporary art right now because what I've seen of it I don't like. Now, this is changing. I think, I hope. But, you know, I was just out at the University of Indiana and talking to a group out there much like this one, and spoke afterwards with chairs of a number of their art departments, and they're telling me that their students are very interested now in making, in the craft of things and how things are put together, and that finally that backlash is coming. And we have to remember, anything you see that is the newest and the greatest in a gallery in New York is 5 years out of being a good idea in the studio, at least. Because it takes a year to get your shit together in the studio to put together your idea, probably another year to put together a body of work, at least another year to get noticed, and then you got 2 years out that most galleries schedule their shows. So even if it is the newest and greatest, it's still 5 years old. And if it's in a museum, it's 10 years old. So, again, mine is a minority voice in this. But again, I don't know how much of this is about my work, and how much of this is about me as a curmudgeonly Yankee, and how much of this is me as a maker of things. But I maintain my self-respect through the way in which I make things. And I don't know what that has to do with the art or meaning of the art or anything like that. It's just part of how I do things. But if you don't know how to use your tools and you don't understand your materials, don't waste my time. It's not enough. Craftsmanship is not enough to make it contemporary art. I see it as the price of admission. Most people don't. You.
I'm just curious. Most of the pieces that you've shown us, at least, have a lot of lead and heavy metals in them, and they're allegedly dangerous to work with.
That's what they keep telling me. I've had my lead levels tested on a number of occasions, and I'm way down at the bottom of the absolutely 100% acceptable levels. This skin is actually a entirely sufficient barrier against lead. The molecules of lead are larger than the pores in your skin. However, you got to be careful not to eat, smoke, drink when you're handling the stuff without washing your hands, because it will go in through your lungs or your digestive system. But no, it's entirely safe to handle new lead.
Are the little soldiers that you made the flag out of, are they like standing up or lying down on it?
Both. And what I actually did was I cut the bases off about half or 2/3 of them, so that they could lie down without having their little bases sticking up. And that piece, again, you know, they say that good design disappears. You have to work really, really, really hard at something just to have it not be noticed at all. And I had to work really, really, really hard to hit that sweet spot where they stopped being individual objects and started being an object, and hovered right at that point between, are they individual objects? Are they individual objects having relationships? Is it an object? And that tension is where it's successful. Yeah. The back.
Is the American flag made out of wires?
Which? The lead one?
The giant one.
Oh, no, that's made out of, the one at the very beginning?
Yeah,
That is made out of industrial felt,
industrial felt.
because it didn't hold water. Industrial felt, non-woven industrial textile products don't hold water. This I learned.
And what is the teddy bear made of, and the outfit?
Kevlar, recycled U.S. government body armor.
Oh,
wow. There was actually, as we were taking the flak jackets apart, there was sand pouring out from between the layers onto the floor.
Did you wash that or dye it?
No, that is the color of Kevlar. Kevlar is banana yellow, and the green is the green top. There is the cover. Yeah, exactly.
You touched a little bit on the role of craft and its presence within contemporary art, and the role, kind of this idea of craftsmanship. But you also talked about your studio assistants, and I'm thinking of other members of the contemporary art scene that have a concept that's made by other people. And so I wonder if you can talk about the relationship of that process and the maker, when it may not be the artist that is the generator of that skill.
Well, it's a good question, and this has been a tension since Auguste Rodin worked. You know, if Rodin had done every step of every piece of all of his sculptures, he would still be working and would have 50 years yet to go. Sculpture is a very labor-intensive process. It always has been and always will be. There are not enough hours in the day for me to do every single hand stitch in that lead flag. The place that I find my pride in craftsmanship is I have done more of those stitches than anybody else will do. And I can do any aspect of any of my sculptures. And in some cases, like there was a piece, I had an assistant who had studied ceramics at RISD. Cool, we get to work with porcelain. So I learned how to work with porcelain from him so that we could make these porcelain objects together. And no, I don't have a lot of patience for the napkin sketch artists. But, you know, most folks think that's fine.
Any work that you have done all yourself, of the stuff that you showed us, that has been just you?
I have to knit with solid steel needles with these incredible wrist braces on, because it takes so much force to manipulate the metal that anything other than steel will snap. and the steel regularly bends, and I have to bend it back. I had an assistant from, again, I was talking about working with assistants and learning from them as they're learning from me, and there was a young woman who was a senior in the apparel design program at RISD. So we worked together to generate these patterns, and I'd say, "What about this?" And she'd say, "Well, you really don't want to do it like that because you'll have this problem." And I, "Well, what about doing it like this?" And we worked together, and then she sewed some of them, I sewed some of them. I actually did glue the vast majority of these soldiers down myself, although I had some help with some of it. I glued down all of these, but I've made a couple of more since that I had to have help with. I did not do all the stitching of that myself, although I did more than anybody else did. And on and on. This I did almost entirely, I did this one entirely myself. Not that one, I had help with that one, and obviously I had help with this one.
So how do you find suppliers to do stuff like get enough plastic army men or whatever?
I know a guy.
How do you find these guys?
I know other guys.
How did you make contact with the first one?
Internet. Well, now you know a guy. You.
What's your email?
What type of
This
metal
guy.
did you use for the little pings on the...
Very good question. O1 tool steel. It's the same exact material that was used on the tines of the music boxes made in Austria and Switzerland in the 19th century. I took a little trip up to the Music Box Museum in Wiscasset, Maine. Who knew? And talked to an exceedingly strange little man whose career has been the repair and refurbishment of music boxes. That's what he does. And passing strange, I think would be the way you put it. But we had a long discussion, and he gave me the benefit of his knowledge. He's like, "Well, I think they'd have to be about this long, and this is how you grind them, and this is how you tune them." And then I called up this other guy at Providence, Providence Heat Treating, and he heat treated them for me. And it's this whole long process, which, as maddening as it is sometimes, is also kind of part of the fun. I got to see the back room of this industrial heat treating facility that's been around since Moses wore short pants.
How did you have those little pings made? Were they machined in a shop?
Yes, machine actually, and again, I did the first round of machining, but I'm not that good with a Bridgeport. I had to turn them over to a machinist to tune them up. But I actually tuned them by hand with a grinder. I had a guitar tuner here, I had them clamped to my anvil, and a 4-inch grinder here, and I'd go, bing! Okay, still a little flat. Bing! Now a little sharp. For all of them. It's crazy.
You're sculpting and going through this process of collecting all these materials and talking to these people. Does your original idea evolve and change?
Of course.
Okay. So for example, this piece right here, what did it start out as? Like in your head, like what was, or on the piece of paper, like what was it originally?
Well, first of all, I can't draw with a damn.
Okay.
So it started out as an idea, and then it became a scale model. But I didn't know how the hell a music box worked, really. I mean, I went on to learn more about music box history and operation than anybody should know. But, when I made the first model, the tines were just sort of stuck on the top, and it communicated the idea, but I didn't know what I was talking about. And then it evolved, and then, so it changes, but within parameters. And that's where the craftsmanship and the art making stays. And that's the difference between, in my mind, the napkin sketch artist and the sculptor. Is because I'm there, keeping it, what is acceptable, what isn't acceptable, how can it change, how can't it change?
How do the pings not snap off? Is that piece of wood that's going around the edge prevent them from sitting on the floor? Like, 'cause
Yes,
if you
exactly.
forward,
Yeah, those are house jacks, and there's another one on the other side to keep it up off the ground by about 2 inches.
But like, so you can make it sound.
And the whole thing is driven by this leather belt. There's a giant electric
That's
motor
a really
over
old
here.
Caterpillar then. That's a really old caterpillar then.
No, that's all sort of. This actually is about 90% faux.
Really?
Probably 95%. It fooled the dealer though. But this space is down a hallway and 1 story down with no back door. So this piece comes apart into 35 individual pieces that all had to be lowered down with a winch and then put back together. The first place it showed was on the 2nd floor with a classroom underneath in a building that was built in 1950. I didn't go to class that day.
Materials that you've yet to work with that you are interested to experiment with.
As soon as carbon nanotubes get economically viable, I'll figure out something to do with them. Should I tell them about the spider?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. It didn't take much encouragement. I think the company is bankrupt now. The last I heard about it was about 8 years ago. But there's a company up in Canada that figured out if you inject DNA from golden orb weaver spiders into the fertilized eggs of Angora goats, you get a goat that is part spider. I am not making this up. The goat excretes spider silk proteins into their milk. Then what the idea was, then you send the goat milk through a strainer to remove all the milk, and you end up with this goo that you send through an artificial spider, and you end up with spider silk. Because spider silk is amazingly strong, but you can't farm spiders because they eat each other.
So
It's
if
true.
you want to work with goat, you...
Totally! Don't you?
Have you ever thought about doing something with like iridium shells?
Huh?
Iridium shells.
Yes.
Yeah.
Your artwork.
You're talking about depleted uranium
Yes.
artillery rounds? Interestingly enough, the depleted uranium, the reason that it's used for ordnance has nothing to do with its radioactivity. It's just that once it has depleted all the way, it's denser than lead, which means it hits harder than lead. So, interestingly enough. But the, yeah. Come on, tough questions.
I'm
You guys
thinking about aesthetic choices, and you've been using the flag motif for a while, and there's a history there with Jasper Johns and various people taking that flag motif and sort of subverting it in a way. And so I'm just kind of interested in, you've stated that you have an idea and you execute it, and when do you subvert your own idea, or do you, and why not?
God, I've become so subversive, I'm subverting myself? That's awesome.
But you're not subversive. No, I didn't mean it that way.
I didn't.
I'm actually kind of serious of the history behind you is there, and then entering that dialogue, say just with the American flag, you had American craft, and the traditional arts, and then you take that flag into lead and these various other materials. So I'm just kind of curious, when do you stop with the flag, move to something else, how you're thinking about a Jasper Johns behind you?
When I get bored and wander off is when I move on to something else. But it's very important to me that I am not actually subverting the American flag. I'm getting there. But I actually have the technical drawing of the American flag. It's all expressed in terms of proportions. And every one of the flags that I make is actually an American flag. And that's very important to me, that it's not my rendering and filtered version of an American flag, but it is actually an American flag, which puts it within the same, this object's contemporaries are not limited to Jasper Johns. This object's contemporaries are the flag on the side of a Humvee in Kabul. Its contemporaries are the flag that's on the moon. Its contemporaries are the flag that was in the front of the congressional hearing room when McCarthy was on his witch hunt. It's by being so very intently accurate. It's able to broaden its meaning. I mean, to a certain extent, I guess I'm being disingenuous because I'm intentionally ignoring the sort of long lineage of the use of the American flag, but the reason I'm interested in using it is for the same reasons that they were interested in using it. It is so much a part of who I am. You know, all of my work is very expressionistic, it's very subjective, it's very much the view from my window. It's who I am and where I'm from. And we're talking about complicated objects and objects that have multiple meanings that are often contradictory. I mean, nothing gets at that like the American flag. You know, on one hand, my family came here in 3 centuries from 4 countries to escape religious persecution. My grandfather had a 7th grade education and raised 4 kids. My dad went to college, and I get to make art for a living. At the same time, there is a horrific war currently occurring on the border of Mexico and America, entirely fueled by American drug money and facilitated by guns bought legally in the United States. Like, how do I reconcile those two? That there is this horrific thing happening every day in southern Texas that we should all be ashamed of. And balancing that with the highest ideals of this country that I was raised in and believe in. I mean, I'm proof of it. For me not to acknowledge the unbelievable privilege that every single person in this room is heir to is the worst kind of arrogance. That, I mean, we are citizens of the wealthiest country in the history of the world. I mean, we have an obesity problem among the poor. That's how rich we are. I'm not saying it ain't a problem, but I'm saying we have an obesity problem among the poor. Ever since the Neolithic Revolution, we've had a starvation problem among the poor. Now, we have to deal with it, and of course there are all kinds of socioeconomic and food production is a whole other thing, and it's a much longer conversation, but it's the worst kind of cultural arrogance to ignore the privilege that I'm coming from. At the same time, it is almost as bad a cultural arrogance to ignore the horrific things done in my name around the world. That's as close as I can get to an answer to that, I think. But it was a meaty question, you'll have to agree.
Yes, judgment. It doesn't seem like you convey your art through color. It is a visual medium at points, but through the way that you speak and how you talk about what it takes for your art to become real, it feels very textile, not textile, but like tactile.
It's a very astute observation, and you're absolutely correct. I don't have a particularly good eye for color. I never have.
And you mentioned in the museum how they put your teddy bear in a little plexiglass box. Would you prefer, or do you think it's possible to create art that the audience is supposed to interact with tactilely?
That's a line of thought worth pursuing, not by me.
Okay.
I'm perfectly happy to put the art behind a box and have people really want to touch it and not be able to. I'm totally comfortable with that. We showed another one of my pieces, the money dress. We actually had to have in the gallery show where we first showed it, we actually had to have an intern standing in front of the piece like this, holding a knitted sample of the material just because we had to get people to stop touching it because they were starting to damage it. You had a question.
As you negotiate the world of contemporary art and craft and industrial arts, and engineering and library science, and as a networker, do you see craft and do you see art in developing and maintaining those relationships? And what do you see as some of your core skills that can help to synthesize and bring together these really kind of parochial and disparate environments together through your work?
I am a stubborn son of a bitch.
Cool.
That's one of them. I think I have a certain amount of arrogance that I'm willing to sort of assume that people are willing to talk to me. And like I'm willing, the way that my first big project, I wanted to set up 2 backhoes as if they were knitting. So I took my Tonka truck from when I was a little kid, my little Tonka truck backhoe, and ripped the shovel off and put on a knitting needle and walked into the local tractor dealership and said, "You're the owner, right?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "I want to do this. Can I borrow some tractors?" And he said, "You have any money to transport them?" I said, "No." He said, "Yeah, okay."
Wait, really?
Yeah. No, that's exactly how I got going with it. And, you know, it's the same kind of thing. It's like the way that I did this other piece where I wanted to continue to work, so the world's largest manufacturer of steel wool, any steel wool pad that you've seen in the last 10 years was made by this company, no matter what label is on it. Global Materials Technology. I wanted statuary bronze spun into wool so that I could knit it. Well, I found that not on the American version of the company's website, but on the Chinese version of the company's website, the president's direct phone number was on the website. So I called him. And before he knew what happened, he was shipping me crates of the stuff. The phone number's no longer on the website. I have never gotten this far into a talk without somebody riding me about the gender thing. That's fine with me.
What do you mean?
All right, fine. I often get hammered early with a question that I try and deflect somewhat about gender coding and knitting and traditional gender roles, which I should probably inject at this point that considering all the work that's been done in the last 10 years about gender theory and gender continuums versus gender binaries, and I don't know thing. Like I'm totally out of that discussion. So it's not that I disregard it or disrespect it, it's just that I haven't participated in it, so I don't know the language. But handicraft has been traditionally coded as feminine in our culture. And industrial stuff has been gender-coded male. Some of that is constructed, some of that is genetic. I don't know. It's not my discussion. But I am recontextualizing a lot of materials via, like, I'm recontextualizing coded materials via a coded process to get a dislocated object that fits into this coding somewhere. The reason that I don't bring it up and that I usually try and dodge it is because it's the easiest punchline for people to write about. And so early on I had a real problem with my work getting anybody to see past that. It's less of a problem now, largely because my body of work has grown beyond the knitted stuff. So I hope I answered my question. After I left Landmark, matriculated to Brown, did a bunch of work around education, came to a crossroads, had to decide what I really wanted to do, decided that I wanted to make art. After I graduated, decided that I wanted to make art full-time because it was going to be the only thing that I was going to be any good at. Because if I tried to teach, I'd be a lousy teacher if I was trying to make art. And if I tried to be a construction worker, I'd be a lousy construction worker while I tried to make art. Or I wouldn't make any art. So I decided to do it until the wheels fall off. Now, that said, I would advise highly against it unless you really can't think of anything else.
What's your objective in making such strong political statements like that? Because you brought in you know, the drug wars in Texas. I'm from Texas, like I know about that, you know, and you clearly are informed by some opinions that you have. So what do you think, I guess my question is, what do you think today in this world, what do you think art does politically, you know, like, or
I see
for the
there's
world?
two questions there you're trying to ask.
Yeah.
The first one is, quit screwing around, Cole, what are you trying to say?
Yeah,
Is
yeah,
the
what are you
first
trying
one.
to say?
I'm not trying to tell anybody what to think. There is no, it is not expository. It is not an essay. There is not a conclusion. If it has any metaphor to any poem, to any writing, it's more of a poem. Or a koan, maybe. Okay, that's a little highfalutin. It's a poem. Because the truth is both. And I have, it's not that I'm unwilling to tell you what I think. It's that I believe that both are true. Is that I believe that we should be ashamed of the situation in South Texas and North Mexico right now. I think it's a national embarrassment. It's a travesty. I think that it is going to be one of history's great tragedies that on September 12th, 2001, we had the sympathy of the world, and the President of the United States could have done anything he wanted to, and he decided to go to war with a country that had nothing to do with it. Like, that's true, but the wealth and privilege that we live with, the freedom that we enjoy, the realities of my experience express the flip side of that. And both are true. It's the best I can get. And if I can find something that will articulate both of those with equal vehemence, I'm getting at an object that can be the beginning of a discussion. Or something.
In that way, do you feel that your work in some way is exercising your own demons, or do you see it as a form of protest against that?
Protest against what?
Well, against the atrocities.
Well, first of all, we'll go back to something I said at the very beginning, which is, anytime I've tried to make a piece of art by setting out to make a piece of art about something, the piece of art that I end up with is the worst kind of derivative rubbish and goes straight onto the scrap heap in the studio. Because it doesn't work that way. The good work is the work that comes fully formed and is shaped by the process of making it and incorporates both sides both sides of this sort of balanced thing. There's no protest, because in order to protest, I'd have to be telling you what to think. I don't have time for that. I ain't got time for that. Nobody got time for that.
Nobody got time for that.
Ain't nobody got time for that. In the back.
You said earlier when you were talking about your contemporaries how it's the word hipster bullshit.
Bullshit hipster garbage art, I think was the term that I used. Yeah.
But from my experience with hipsters, having known many, there's not much more hipster than knitting woodwork.
Nice!
And also I mean, what is your definition of garbage art? Is it just taking something and making it out of something else? Is it, because, don't get me wrong, first of all, I've never heard of you before tonight. Didn't know what you were at all. Love your work. That's very thought-provoking. It hit me very, like, that's cool. Like, that's awesome. Like, the whole, like, your American flag pieces particularly, how you get me. You get me how I love my country. It's the greatest country ever, but it's got problems. And I don't agree with everything in it, like, but it's still my country, and it's still my flag. Like, it really spoke to me of the inner conflict that I deal with every day, looking at the political scene, things like that. But at the same time, it's sort of this whole, put a burn on it thing. Let me take an American flag and I'll make it out of toothpaste. I'll take an American flag and I'll make it out of nails. I'll take an American flag and make it out of my toe clippings. I'll take an American flag.
You could probably sell it too.
You got it.
What's the question?
I guess my question was more.
Because I'll answer the question.
It was more along the lines of what your definition of what hipster garbage art is, I suppose. Is more of a clarification on that to separate yourself from the pack since you don't believe you're a part of that movement.
That's sort of an offhanded way of referring to piles of unfinished plaster, chunks of 2x4s, sheetrock screws, cast hands that are just.
You're more referring to that
a genre.
They have the ideas, but they don't have the finesse. They don't have the skill itself to make the finished product they're trying to make.
I'll go back to what I said at the beginning, which is this is a minority opinion. But if you don't understand your materials and if you don't know how to use your tools, don't waste my time.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, what a great note to end on. I'm going to stick around right here for a while, so if anybody has anything else to say or, wants to punch me in the nose, come on down.